The first thing Detective Sarah Chen noticed about the camping equipment wasn't its pristine condition after 4 decades underground, but the way it had been deliberately arranged. The blue Coleman sleeping bag lay perfectly flat beneath the twisted roots of a lodgepole pine, its zipper still partially open as if someone had just climbed out. A red thermos sat upright against a granite boulder, its contents long since evaporated, but the stainless steel surface bore no oxidation that should have accumulated over 43 years of burial beneath Yellowstone's acidic soil. Chen crouched beside the makeshift excavation site, her knees pressing into the volcanic pumice that had been displaced by yesterday's unprecedented eruption from Emerald Pool. The geyser, dormant for over a century, had suddenly roared to life at 3:47 a.m. on September 14, 2024, hurling superheated water and debris 40 feet into the air. Park rangers had cordoned off the area within hours, but not before hikers had spotted something that made Chen's phone ring at her desk in Bozeman at 6:23 a.m. Detective Chen, this is Ranger Martinez at Yellowstone. We have a situation that's going to require your expertise. The voice on the other end carried the weight of someone who had seen too much in 20 years of park service. The Emerald Pool eruption uncovered what appears to be camping equipment, old camping equipment, and we think it might be connected to the Morrison family disappearance. Chen had inherited the Morrison file when she transferred to Montana's Major Crimes Unit 3 years ago. The manila folder, thick with witness statements and search reports, had occupied a corner of her desk like a persistent reminder of unfinished business. The Morrison family. Robert, 42, his wife Helen, 38, and their 3 children Katie, 16, Danny, 14, and little Emma, 8, had vanished without a trace during their summer camping trip to Yellowstone in August 1981. Their 1978 Ford Bronco had been found abandoned in the parking area of the Grand Prismatic Spring, keys still in the ignition, but the family had simply evaporated into the wilderness like morning mist. Now, as Chen examined the artifacts that had been violently expelled from the Earth's depths, she felt the familiar tingle of a case awakening from its cold sleep. The camping gear bore the unmistakable patina of the early 1980s, the faded orange of a Coleman lantern, the geometric patterns of a sleeping bag that hadn't been manufactured since Reagan's first term. But there was something else, something that made her stomach tighten with a mixture of anticipation and dread. "Ranger Martinez," she called to the weathered man standing 30 feet away, maintaining the perimeter. "Has anyone else been down here since the eruption?" "No, ma'am. We secured the scene as soon as we realized what we were looking at." The hikers who first spotted it were moved back immediately, and we've had continuous coverage since dawn. Chen stood, her joints protesting after the 2-hour drive from Bozeman, followed by the quarter-mile hike to the site. She pulled out her digital camera, a Canon EOS that had replaced the film cameras she'd used early in her career, and began documenting the scene with methodical precision. Each photograph captured not just the physical evidence but the story it seemed to tell, or perhaps more accurately, the story it refused to tell. The Morrison disappearance had generated national attention in 1981, back when missing persons cases could still dominate news cycles for weeks. Robert Morrison had been a well-respected insurance executive from Denver, the kind of steady family man who coached Little League and never missed a PTA meeting. Helen had taught 3rd grade at Cherry Creek Elementary, beloved by students and parents alike. Their children had been typical products of suburban Colorado honor roll students, active in school activities, with no history of running away or family discord. They had arrived at Yellowstone on August 12, 1981, checking into the Grant Village campground with a reservation that Robert had made 6 months in advance. Fellow campers remembered them as a quiet, polite family who kept to themselves but seemed genuinely excited to be exploring the park. The last confirmed sighting had been on August 15th, when a park ranger had spoken with Robert near the Grand Prismatic Overlook, discussing the best trails for families with young children. 3 days later, when they failed to check out of their campsite, rangers had conducted a welfare check. The family's Ford Bronco sat empty in the parking area, its doors unlocked and windows rolled down. Personal items remained scattered throughout the vehicle. Helen's purse with $47 cash, the children's jackets, a cooler containing sandwiches that had begun to spoil in the August heat. But there was no sign of the family themselves, no indication of where they might have gone or what had happened to them. The initial search had been massive, involving over 200 volunteers, multiple helicopter sweeps, and tracking dogs from 3 different agencies. Every trail within a 10-mile radius of Grand Prismatic had been combed repeatedly. Dive teams had searched the thermal pools, despite the obvious impossibility of survival in water that reached temperatures of 160 degrees Fahrenheit. The investigation had consumed resources for months, following every lead from reported sightings in Canada to theories about voluntary disappearance, but ultimately yielded nothing more substantial than speculation and false hope. Chen had studied the case files obsessively during her first year in Montana, drawn to the mystery not just by professional obligation but by personal curiosity. The complete absence of evidence seemed to defy the laws of physics. 5 people couldn't simply vanish in one of the most monitored wilderness areas in America, yet that appeared to be exactly what had happened. Until today. "Detective, you need to see this." Crime scene photographer Mike Torres emerged from behind a cluster of boulders, his face pale beneath his baseball cap. Torres had worked major crimes for 15 years, documenting everything from domestic violence to gang murders. But something in his expression suggested this was different. Chen followed him to a depression in the ground, approximately 20 feet from the initial camping gear discovery. The recent eruption had created a crater-like indentation about 4 feet deep, and at its center, partially embedded in the hardened mineral deposits, was a child's sneaker. The shoe was small, sized for perhaps an 8-year-old, with a faded rainbow design that Chen recognized from photographs in the Morrison file. Emma Morrison had been wearing identical shoes when she disappeared. "Jesus," Chen whispered, more to herself than to Torres. She knelt beside the crater, studying the shoe's position. Like the camping equipment, it showed remarkably little deterioration for something that had allegedly been buried for over 4 decades. The rubber sole remained flexible, the fabric upper intact despite being subjected to the corrosive geothermal environment. "Mike, I need you to photograph this from every angle before we disturb it," she said, her voice taking on the professional cadence she used to mask emotional reactions. "And then I need you to expand the search grid. If there's one shoe, there might be more." The forensic excavation took 3 days. Chen had requested a team from the Montana State Crime Lab, and they worked with the methodical precision of archaeologists, carefully removing layers of volcanic sediment and mineral deposits. Each artifact was photographed in situ, its position carefully measured and recorded before being placed in sterile evidence bags. The inventory grew steadily, a compass bearing the initials RM engraved on its brass surface, a flashlight with corroded batteries still inside, fragments of what appeared to be a child's stuffed animal, and most significantly, a wallet containing Robert Morrison's driver's license, credit cards, and a family photograph that had somehow survived the decades with only minor water damage. But it was the discovery on day 3 that transformed Chen's investigation from a cold case review into something far more disturbing. Hidden beneath a layer of hardened mineral deposits, Torres found a small spiral notebook, its pages protected by a waterproof plastic cover. The notebook belonged to Katie Morrison, and its contents would haunt Chen for months to come. The entries were written in the careful script of a 16-year-old girl, documenting the family's vacation with the enthusiasm typical of teenagers experiencing wilderness for the first time. But the final entries, dated August 15th and 16th, 1981, revealed a story that none of the original investigators had imagined. "Danny says he saw someone watching us from the trees near our campsite last night. Dad thinks he's making it up, but I believe him. Danny doesn't lie about stuff like that. The man was wearing a park ranger uniform, but something seemed wrong about him. He was too far away to see clearly, but he wasn't moving like the other rangers we've met." Chen read the entry again, her coffee growing cold and the paper cup balanced on her dashboard. She had returned to her hotel room in West Yellowstone after the excavation, but sleep had proved impossible. Instead, she sat in her rental car overlooking the park entrance, studying Katie Morrison's notebook under the dim glow of the dome light. The next entry, dated August 16th, was more disturbing. "The man came closer to our campsite today. He talked to Dad near the parking area, but I couldn't hear what they were saying. When Dad came back, he seemed upset. He told Mom we might need to leave early, but he wouldn't explain why. Emma asked if we were in trouble, and Dad said no, but I could tell he was lying. He had the same expression he gets when he's worried about work." The final entry was brief, written in handwriting that appeared hurried. "Someone is outside our tent. Dad has gone to check. Mom is trying to keep us quiet, but Emma is scared. I can hear voices, but I can't make out the words. Something is wrong. Something is very wrong." Chen closed the notebook and stared out at the dark expanse of Yellowstone, where scattered lights from the park's infrastructure created pools of illumination in the vast wilderness. The Morrison family's story was finally beginning to reveal itself, but each answer seemed to generate more questions. Who was the man in the ranger uniform? What had he discussed with Robert Morrison? And most critically, what had happened during that final night? The next morning, Chen drove to the Yellowstone Heritage and Research Center in Gardner, Montana, where personnel records from the 1980s were archived. The facility, housed in a converted train depot, contained decades of park documentation, including employment records, incident reports, and personnel files that might provide clues about the mysterious figure in Katie Morrison's notebook. Archivist Margaret Yates, a woman in her 70s who had worked at the park in various capacities for over 50 years, greeted Chen with the cautious politeness reserved for law enforcement officers. "I remember the Morrison disappearance," she said, leading Chen through rows of filing cabinets. "We all hoped they'd just gotten lost and would turn up eventually. You never really believe a whole family can just vanish." Chen explained her need to review personnel records from August 1981, focusing on rangers who would have been working in the Grand Prismatic area during the Morrison family's visit. Yates produced a thick folder containing duty rosters, shift schedules, and personnel assignments for the relevant time period. There were 12 rangers assigned to the Grand Prismatic and surrounding area in August 1981, Yates explained, spreading the documents across a wooden table. Most of them were seasonal employees, college students working summer jobs before returning to school. But there were also 5 permanent staff members, including the area supervisor. Chen studied the roster, noting names, ages, and brief physical descriptions. One name caught her attention: Thomas Brennan, 34, a permanent ranger who had been employed at Yellowstone for 7 years. According to his personnel file, Brennan had been assigned to the Grand Prismatic area from August 10th through August 20th, 1981. Placing him in the exact location where the Morrison family had last been seen. "Can you tell me about Thomas Brennan?" Chen asked, pointing to the name on the roster. Yates frowned, her expression becoming guarded. Tom Brennan was complicated. He was a good ranger in many ways, knew the park better than almost anyone. But he had some personal issues. Drinking problems, mostly. And he could be difficult to work with. "What happened to him?" "He resigned suddenly in September 1981, just a few weeks after the Morrison family disappeared. Said he was taking a job with the Forest Service in Alaska. As far as I know, nobody here ever heard from him again." Chen felt the familiar quickening of pulse that accompanied a significant breakthrough. "Do you have his personnel file?" Yates hesitated. "I'm not sure I should release that without proper authorization. Personnel records are confidential, even for former employees." "This is part of a homicide investigation," Chen said, stretching the truth slightly. "I can obtain a warrant if necessary, but time is crucial." The file that Yates eventually produced painted a picture of a man struggling with personal demons. Thomas Brennan had been hired by the National Park Service in 1974, following 4 years of military service in Vietnam. His performance evaluations were mixed, praising his knowledge of wilderness survival and his ability to handle emergency situations, but noting recurring issues with authority and what supervisors diplomatically termed interpersonal difficulties. The most relevant information was contained in an incident report from July 1981, just 1 month before the Morrison disappearance. Brennan had been reprimanded for approaching park visitors' campsites without authorization, behavior that had generated complaints from multiple families. The report noted that Brennan had been, quote, counseled regarding appropriate boundaries, and warned that further incidents would result in suspension. Chen photographed the relevant documents with her phone, then requested copies of any incident reports involving Brennan during his tenure at the park. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Multiple complaints about inappropriate behavior, including allegations that he had followed female visitors and made unwelcome advances. Most concerning was a report from August 1980, exactly 1 year before the Morrison disappearance, describing Brennan's harassment of a family camping near Grand Prismatic. The complainant stated that Ranger Brennan approached their campsite multiple times over a 3-day period, asking personal questions about their family and travel plans, the report read. When asked to leave them alone, Brennan became hostile and threatened to cite them for campground violations. The family cut their vacation short and requested a refund. Chen left the archives with a growing sense that Thomas Brennan was the key to unraveling the Morrison mystery. But finding a man who had disappeared into the Alaskan wilderness 43 years ago would require resources and expertise beyond her immediate capabilities. She needed help, and she knew exactly where to find it. FBI Special Agent David Martinez operated out of the Billings field office, where he specialized in cold cases and missing persons investigations. Chen had worked with him on 2 previous cases, and she trusted his methodical approach and extensive network of contacts. When she called him from her hotel room that evening, Martinez listened without interruption as she summarized the discovery at Emerald Pool and her findings regarding Thomas Brennan. "You're describing a classic predator scenario," Martinez said when she finished. "A man in a position of authority, targeting isolated families, using his uniform and knowledge of the park to gain access to victims. The timing of his resignation is particularly significant." "Can you help me locate him?" Chen asked. "I need to know if Thomas Brennan is still alive, and if so, where he's been for the past 4 decades. I'll run him through the federal databases tonight. Social Security, IRS, military records, anything that might have left a paper trail. But if he's been deliberately avoiding detection, it might take some time." Chen spent the next day interviewing retired park employees who had worked with Brennan during his tenure at Yellowstone. The picture that emerged was consistently troubling. A man who had returned from Vietnam with unresolved trauma, who drank heavily and exhibited increasingly erratic behavior. Several former colleagues described him as someone who had lost his way after military service, unable to readjust to civilian life. "Tom was a good soldier," said retired Ranger Supervisor Carl Hoffman, now 82 and living in a nursing home in Billings. "But something had broken inside him over there. He'd disappear for days at a time, camping alone in the backcountry. We all thought he was just working through his demons, but looking back, maybe we should have been more concerned." "Did he ever mention the Morrison family specifically?" Chen asked. Hoffman's roomy eyes focused on something beyond the window. "He was obsessed with that case. After they disappeared, he spent all his free time searching for them. Said he knew something the FBI didn't. We thought he was just trying to be helpful, but what? He knew too much. About their camping habits, their planned routes, things that weren't in the official reports. When I asked him how he knew so much about their movements, he got angry. Said he was just being thorough." Chen's phone buzzed with a text from Martinez. "Found him. Call me." She excused herself from the interview and stepped into the hallway, dialing Martinez's number with shaking fingers. "Thomas Brennan didn't go to Alaska," Martinez said without preamble. "He went to Oregon, where he worked for the Forest Service under his real name until 1987. Then he moved to Northern California, where he worked for a private security company until 1995. After that, the trail goes cold." "What do you mean, cold?" "I mean, he stopped filing tax returns, stopped updating his Social Security records, stopped existing in any official capacity. Either he's dead or he's been living off the grid for the past 30 years. Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Montana weather. Or he's been very careful about not leaving traces. That's what I'm thinking. But I found something else that's going to interest you. Between 1987 and 1995, when Brennan was working for that security company in California, there were 3 unsolved disappearances of families camping in national forests within a 200-mile radius of his residence. The revelation hit Chen like a physical blow. 3 families, the Hendersons in 1989, the Kowalskis in 1991, and the Tanaka family in 1994. All of them disappeared while camping in remote areas, all of them left behind vehicles and personal belongings, and none of them were ever found. Chen leaned against the wall for support, her mind racing through the implications. If Thomas Brennan was responsible for the Morrison disappearance, he might be a serial killer who had continued his crimes for decades. The family's camping gear buried beneath Yellowstone might represent just the beginning of a much larger pattern of violence. "David, I need you to request files on all 3 California cases, and I need you to run a nationwide search for any similar disappearances that might fit the same pattern." "Already on it," Martinez replied. "But Chen, If this is what I think it is, we're looking at one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Someone who's been operating for 40 years without being detected. The next phase of the investigation required Chen to travel to California, where she spent a week reviewing the files of the 3 families who had disappeared during Brennan's residency there. The similarities to the Morrison case were undeniable. All 3 families had been camping in isolated areas. All had left behind vehicles containing personal belongings, and all had vanished without leaving any trace of their whereabouts. The Henderson family had been camping in the Shasta Trinity National Forest when they disappeared in September 1989. Mark Henderson, 38, his wife Susan, 35, and their twin daughters, both 12, had been reported missing when they failed to return from a weekend camping trip. Their pickup truck was found at a trailhead, keys in the ignition, but despite extensive searches, no trace of the family was ever discovered. The Kowalski case from 1991 was even more disturbing. James Kowalski, 45, his wife Patricia, 42, and their son Michael, 17, had vanished while camping in the Mendocino National Forest. Their campsite showed signs of a struggle, with overturned equipment and scattered clothing, but no blood or other evidence of violence. The investigating officers had theorized that the family might have been attacked by a mountain lion or bear, but no animal remains were ever found. The Tanaka family disappearance in 1994 had generated the most media attention. Dr. Kenneth Tanaka, a prominent pediatrician from San Francisco, had taken his wife Marie and their 2 children, ages 10 and 14, on a camping trip to the Los Padres National Forest. When they failed to return, search teams had discovered their campsite abandoned, with food still cooking over a camp stove and sleeping bags laid out, as if the family had simply stepped away for a moment. Chen studied crime scene photographs from all 3 cases, noting similarities in the way campsites had been left undisturbed except for the absence of their occupants. In each case, valuable items had been left behind: jewelry, cameras, cash suggesting that robbery had not been the motive. The only consistent element was the complete disappearance of the families themselves. Working with local law enforcement agencies, Chen began mapping the locations where each family had vanished, looking for patterns that might reveal Thomas Brennan's methods. What she discovered was a man who had systematically stalked families in remote camping areas, using his knowledge of wilderness survival and his ability to move undetected through forest terrain. The breakthrough came when Chen located a former co-worker of Brennan's at the California security company. Harold Voss, now 67 and retired, had worked alongside Brennan for 6 years and had developed concerns about his colleagues' behavior. Tom was skilled at surveillance, Voss explained during a phone interview. That was his specialty at the company, following people without being detected. But he took it too far. He'd follow subjects home, learn their routines, study their families. The company had to warn him multiple times about exceeding his assignments. Did he ever mention camping or national forests? All the time. He'd disappear on weekends, said he was camping alone in the mountains, but he'd come back with stories about the families he'd encountered, descriptions of their campsites, their routines. It was like he was studying them. Chen felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Thomas Brennan had been a predator who used his professional skills to identify and stalk vulnerable families, following them to remote locations where he could act without witnesses. The Morrison family had been his first known victims, but certainly not his last. The question that haunted Chen was what had happened to the families after Brennan had abducted them. The camping gear found at Yellowstone suggested that the Morrisons had been killed and buried in the geothermal area, but thermal pools would have destroyed any human remains decades ago. The other families had vanished in different locations, which meant there might be other burial sites scattered across the western United States. FBI profiler Dr. Rebecca Shaw, whom Martinez had brought in to consult on the case, provided insight into Brennan's likely psychological profile. He's what we call an organized killer, Shaw explained during a conference call. He plans his attacks carefully, chooses isolated victims, and disposes of evidence methodically. The fact that he's avoided detection for 40 years suggests he's highly intelligent and extremely disciplined. What are the chances he's still alive? Chen asked. Given his age and the physical demands of his crimes, he's probably either dead or incapacitated. But if he's alive, he's most likely living in isolation, possibly somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, where he can continue his surveillance activities without arousing suspicion. The investigation took another dramatic turn when Martinez called Chen with news that would reshape their understanding of the case. "We found him," he said simply. "Thomas Brennan is alive, and he's been living in a cabin in the Olympic National Forest for the past 20 years. Chen felt her heart rate accelerate. "Are you certain? Washington State Police have been monitoring a hermit who's been living off the grid near Lake Quinault. When they ran his fingerprints through the system, they matched prints from Brennan's military service record. He's been living alone in a one-room cabin, surviving on hunting and fishing, avoiding all contact with authorities. When do we move?" "Tomorrow morning. I've coordinated with the Washington State Police and local FBI. We'll approach the cabin at dawn, before he has a chance to run." Chen caught the first flight from Sacramento to Seattle, then drove 3 hours through the dense forests of the Olympic Peninsula. The landscape was dramatically different from the high desert of Montana, with towering evergreens creating a canopy so thick that daylight barely penetrated to the forest floor. As she navigated the winding roads toward Lake Quinault, Chen felt the weight of 43 years of questions pressing down on her. The staging area for the arrest was a Forest Service station 5 miles from Brennan's cabin. Chen arrived to find a small army of law enforcement officers preparing for what they hoped would be a peaceful apprehension. Martinez briefed her on the tactical plan while officers checked their equipment and reviewed maps of the surrounding area. "The cabin is accessible only by a hiking trail," Martinez explained. "No vehicle access, no phone lines, no electricity. Brennan has been living like a 19th century hermit, but he's still dangerous. We have to assume he's armed and will resist arrest." Chen had requested permission to participate in the arrest, despite the fact that she was technically outside her jurisdiction. The Washington State Police had agreed to let her observe from a safe distance, understanding that she had developed the most comprehensive knowledge of Brennan's crimes. The hike to the cabin took 45 minutes through terrain that would have challenged experienced hikers. Chen followed behind the tactical team, her breath forming visible clouds in the cold morning air. The forest was eerily quiet, with only the sound of boots on wet leaves and the distant call of ravens to break the silence. When they reached the cabin, Chen was struck by how ordinary it appeared. The structure was crude but functional, built from rough-hewn logs and covered with a rusted metal roof. Smoke rose from a chimney, indicating that Brennan was inside, and his movements were visible through a single window. "Thomas Brennan, this is the FBI," Martinez called through a megaphone. "Exit the cabin with your hands visible. You're under arrest." For long minutes, there was no response. Then the cabin door opened slowly, and a figure emerged that Chen barely recognized as human. Thomas Brennan had been transformed by 2 decades of isolation into something resembling a biblical prophet, with wild gray hair and a beard that reached his chest. His clothes were patched and repatched, and his eyes held the feral alertness of a wild animal. "I've been waiting for you," he said simply, raising his hands above his head. The arrest was anticlimactic after the buildup of tension. Brennan offered no resistance, speaking only to request water and to ask about the weather. As officers searched his cabin, Chen studied the man who had haunted her investigation for months, trying to reconcile his harmless appearance with the monster she knew him to be. The cabin's interior revealed the obsessions that had driven Brennan for decades. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings about missing persons cases, maps of national parks and forests, and detailed drawings of camping equipment and hiking gear. Most disturbing were the journals, dozens of them, documenting his observations of families in wilderness areas going back to the 1970s. "He's been planning and executing these crimes for almost 50 years, Martinez said quietly as they examined the evidence. "This isn't just a serial killer. This is someone who's made murder his life's work." Chen found herself staring at a particular journal entry dated August 15, 1981. "The Morrison family is perfect. 5 targets, isolated location, no witnesses. The father is suspicious but not alert enough. The mother is focused on the children. The teenagers are distracted by their own concerns. The little girl will be the most difficult to control, but also the most useful for ensuring compliance from the others." Reading Brennan's cold assessment of the family he was planning to murder, Chen felt a rage so intense it surprised her. This wasn't just a case file anymore. It was a personal confrontation with pure evil. The Morrison family had been reduced to tactical considerations in the mind of a predator who saw them as nothing more than opportunities to satisfy his twisted needs. The interrogation of Thomas Brennan took place in a secure facility in Seattle, where Chen was granted permission to observe from behind one-way glass. FBI Interrogation Specialist Agent Patricia Kowalski led the questioning, using techniques designed to elicit confessions from suspects who had spent decades perfecting their deceptions. Brennan's initial response was predictable: complete denial of any involvement in the Morrison disappearance or any other crimes. He claimed to be a simple hermit who had chosen to live apart from society, insisting that his isolation was motivated by a desire for solitude rather than an attempt to avoid prosecution. "I never hurt anyone," he repeated when confronted with evidence from his cabin. "I just like to watch families camping. There's nothing illegal about that." But as the interrogation continued, cracks began to appear in Brennan's facade. When shown photographs of the camping equipment found at Yellowstone, his carefully controlled expression flickered with something that might have been recognition. When confronted with specific details from Katie Morrison's journal, he became agitated and began contradicting his earlier statements. "Tell me about the night of August 16, 1981, Agent Kowalski said, her voice maintaining the same calm tone she had used throughout the session. "You approached the Morrison family's campsite. What happened next?" Brennan's response was barely audible. "I don't remember." "You don't remember? Or you don't want to remember?" "I was drinking then. I had problems with alcohol. Sometimes I did things I regretted." Chen watched from the observation room as Brennan's defenses slowly crumbled. The man who had successfully evaded capture for over 4 decades was finally confronting the reality that his crimes had been discovered. When Agent Kowalski placed crime scene photographs from the California cases on the table, Brennan's composure finally shattered. "I never meant for it to happen," he said, his voice breaking. "I just wanted to be close to them, to be part of their families. But they always rejected me. They always made me feel like an outsider." Over the next 6 hours, Thomas Brennan confessed to murdering the Morrison family and the 3 California families, as well as 2 additional families whose disappearances had never been connected to him. His method was consistent. He would stalk families in remote camping areas, learning their routines and vulnerabilities, then approach them under the pretense of official business. Using his knowledge of wilderness survival, he would lead them to isolated locations where he could kill them without witnesses. The details of the murders were more disturbing than Chen had anticipated. Brennan had forced the families to participate in elaborate psychological games, using their love for each other as weapons to ensure compliance. Children were threatened to control parents, parents were tortured to control children, and the process was extended over hours or sometimes days before the final killings. The Morrison family was special, Brennan explained with a detachment that chilled Chen to her core. They were so normal, so perfect. I wanted to preserve that perfection, to keep them with me forever. So I buried their belongings in the thermal area, where the earth would hold them safe. When asked about the bodies, Brennan's response was matter-of-fact. I dissolved them in the thermal pools. The heat and chemicals destroy everything organic within hours. It's the perfect disposal method. Chen left the interrogation room feeling emotionally drained, but professionally satisfied. The Morrison case, which had haunted investigators for over 4 decades, was finally solved. Thomas Brennan would spend the rest of his life in prison, and the families of his victims would finally have answers to questions that had tormented them for decades. But the resolution of the case brought its own complications. The families of Brennan's victims had to process the reality that their loved ones had died in circumstances more horrible than they had imagined. The Morrison family's relatives, who had clung to hope for decades, now faced the finality of death and the additional trauma of learning how their family members had suffered. Chen attended the press conference where the resolution of the Morrison case was announced to the media. She watched as FBI Director Sarah Williams outlined the investigation's findings, describing how modern forensic techniques and persistent detective work had finally brought a serial killer to justice. The story dominated news cycles for weeks, with extensive coverage of Brennan's crimes and the investigative techniques that had led to his capture. In the months following Brennan's arrest, Chen worked with victim services specialists to help the families of his victims process the traumatic revelations. The Morrison family's surviving relatives, including Robert's brother James and Helen's sister Patricia, struggled with conflicting emotions of relief and renewed grief. The certainty of death was somehow both easier and harder to accept than the uncertainty they had lived with for so long. "At least now we know," James Morrison said during one of their meetings. "For 43 years we've wondered if they were alive somewhere, if they were suffering, if they might come home. Now we can finally grieve properly and try to move forward." Chen also worked with rangers and administrators at Yellowstone National Park to ensure that the site where the Morrison family's belongings had been found was properly memorialized. A small plaque was installed near Emerald Pool, reading, "In memory of the Morrison family and all victims of violence in our national parks. May their stories remind us to protect and cherish the wilderness they loved." The case had profound effects on Chen's career and personal life. She was promoted to supervisor of the Major Crimes Unit, with expanded responsibilities for cold case investigations throughout Montana. But the intensity of the Morrison investigation had taken its toll, leaving her with nightmares and a persistent sense of unease when camping or hiking in remote areas. Dr. Lisa Chen, a trauma counselor who was no relation despite sharing the same surname, helped Chen process the psychological impact of confronting such extreme violence. "Investigating cases like this changes you," Dr. Chen explained during one of their sessions. "You've seen the worst of human nature, and that knowledge becomes part of you. The challenge is learning to live with that knowledge without letting it consume you." Thomas Brennan was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murders of the Morrison family and the 3 California families. Additional charges were filed in connection with the other murders he had confessed to, ensuring that he would never be released regardless of appeals or legal technicalities. At his sentencing hearing, family members of his victims were given the opportunity to make victim impact statements, a process that was both painful and cathartic for many of them. "You stole our family," Patricia Morrison said, addressing Brennan directly from the witness stand. "You took away our parents, our brother, our sister-in-law, and our nieces and nephew. You robbed us of 43 years of birthdays, holidays, graduations, and all the moments that make life meaningful. But you didn't destroy us. We survived your evil, and we will continue to honor their memory by living fully and loving deeply." Brennan showed no emotion during the victim impact statements, staring straight ahead with the same detached expression he had worn throughout his interrogation. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, he declined, leaving his victims' families without even the minimal satisfaction of an apology. In the aftermath of the case, Chen found herself becoming an advocate for improved investigation techniques in missing persons cases. She spoke at law enforcement conferences about the importance of preserving evidence from cold cases, arguing that advances in forensic technology made it possible to solve crimes that had seemed hopeless decades earlier. "The Morrison family waited 43 years for justice," she told audiences of police officers, FBI agents, and park rangers. "But their story also proves that no case is ever truly cold. Evidence endures, witnesses remember, and perpetrators eventually make mistakes. Our obligation is to never give up, to keep searching for the truth no matter how much time has passed." The Emerald Pool geyser that had revealed the Morrison family's camping equipment returned to dormancy within a few weeks of the discovery, its brief eruption having served its purpose in bringing buried secrets to light. Park geologists studied the phenomenon, trying to understand what had caused the century-old thermal feature to suddenly reactivate, but they found no scientific explanation for the timing. Chen preferred to think of the eruption as something more than mere geological coincidence. The Morrison family had been denied justice for over 4 decades, their story buried as deeply as their belongings beneath the mineral deposits of Yellowstone. The sudden eruption that brought their possessions to the surface felt like a final gift from the wilderness they had loved, a chance for their voices to be heard, and their killer to face consequences. The investigation had revealed not just the fate of one family, but the existence of a predator who had operated in America's national parks and forests for half a century. Thomas Brennan's crimes had been enabled by his knowledge of wilderness areas, his ability to move undetected through remote terrain, and his skill at identifying vulnerable targets. His capture had required the coordination of multiple law enforcement agencies, and the application of modern investigative techniques to evidence that had been preserved by chance beneath the earth. As Chen reflected on the case in the quiet of her office, She realized that the Morrison family's story had become part of a larger narrative about the persistence of truth and the importance of never abandoning hope. Their disappearance had remained a mystery for over 4 decades, but it had never been forgotten. Family members had continued to search, investigators had continued to investigate, and the evidence had waited patiently for the right moment to reveal its secrets. The camping gear found at Emerald Pool had been more than mere evidence. It had been a message from the past, a reminder that some truths cannot be buried forever. The Morrison family's story had finally been told, their killer had been brought to justice, and their memory had been honored by all those who had refused to let their case fade into obscurity. Chen closed the Morrison file for the final time, filing it away in the section reserved for solved cases. But she knew that the family's story would continue to influence her work, reminding her that every missing person represents someone's beloved family member and that the pursuit of justice requires both professional dedication and personal compassion. The wilderness of Yellowstone continued to attract millions of visitors each year, families seeking the same kind of adventure and connection with nature that had brought the Morrisons to the park in 1981. Most of them would never know the dark history that had been revealed beneath Emerald Pool, and perhaps that was as it should be. The national parks remained places of wonder and discovery, where families could create memories and experience the beauty of the natural world. But for those who knew the Morrison family's story, the parks also served as reminders of the importance of vigilance, community, and the responsibility we all share to protect the vulnerable. The Morrison family had been failed by a system that didn't recognize the predator in its midst, but their story had ultimately become a catalyst for improved training, better communication between agencies, and a renewed commitment to preventing similar tragedies. Detective Sarah Chen continued to work cold cases throughout Montana, always carrying with her the lessons learned from the Morrison investigation. She knew that somewhere in the files stacked on her desk were other families waiting for their stories to be told, other mysteries waiting for the right combination of evidence, technology, and persistent investigation to reveal their secrets. The Morrison family's wait for justice had lasted 43 years, but it had finally ended. Their story had become part of the ongoing struggle between those who seek to harm the innocent and those who dedicate their lives to protecting them. In the end, truth had prevailed, justice had been served, and the Morrison family's legacy had become a testament to the power of never giving up hope.